still have a bit of time. We've had no shortage in the market for proposals to solve the crisis, with different degrees of, shall we say, different degrees of radicalism in terms of, and also in terms of their willingness to challenge consensus. Some, I suspect the majority of proposals accepting some of the political constraints that we've observed here in the North. I'd like to open this now to the audience to challenge the speakers on their proposals. We have about, well, it says 18 minutes. We'll have about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, 30 minutes left to discuss this. So, questions from the audience. First question was over there, second over there, third one over here. But I could ask the speakers not to make a speech because I'm going to cut you off because we have very little time. Just make a short comment and a short question, but no long statements, please.
Yes, Peter Dorman. One of the phrases I have not heard today, even though we've been talking about the Eurozone crisis from many different perspectives, is democratic deficit. And I think it's quite relevant here. The European project is a kind of ungainly alliance between the idealism that George Soros referred to as this fantastic object of Europe, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, the self-interested proposals of business interests in Europe to gain from a single market and to some extent reduce the constraints on them. In the context that we're talking about now, this has been most clear in the inability of Europe to do anything about the presence on the banks of large amounts of non-performing assets, which, in addition to the other problems which speakers have mentioned here, greatly complicates how we're going to get out of this mess. And I have nothing constructive to propose except to say that we are really facing now the shortcomings of democracy in Europe.
Thank you. The next second question was, I think, there. Yes, there it was.
My turn.
Thank you. Ricardo Hausmann from Harvard University. Let me preface my question with a view of the crisis. The crisis was, I tend to look at it through the current account. There was massive capital inflows into the countries that benefited from joining the euro and having a lower cost of capital. So they went into a spending boom, an investment boom, a real estate boom, and so on. Large current account deficits. Now the world doesn't want to support those current account deficits. The current account deficit has to fall to something, say, close to zero. And that can be done either by cutting domestic spending or increasing exports or import substitution. So with a fixed exchange rate. So if there's no increase in exports, well, GDP will have to drop by a hell of a lot. We saw in the charts by Marcus how fast GDP grew in Spain and Greece and so on in the upwards. So those levels of GDP cannot be supported with the current levels of exports. And probably if the level of exports remains where they are, GDP will have to fall by 3 times the current account deficit, more or less. So these countries are facing a further drop of GDP of, I don't know, 15 to 20%. So here we have, George Soros proposes a solution to relieve the fiscal burden of the adjustment. But in my reading, it doesn't do anything to the current account adjustment. It doesn't facilitate the movement of resources to the export sector or the import substitution sector, which is the idea about green energy, I presume, right? So that the adjustment can be done in a less contractionary manner. So my question is, did I misunderstand the proposal as being very focused on the fiscal and not resolving the current account issue?
Okay, George, George, would you like to address this?
No, you did not misunderstand it. I said it's not an answer to all the problems. This is one problem that could be solved that way. The banking issue, actually, the proposal that we heard over there was actually the right one. You really need a European recapitalization of the banks, because the incestuous relationship between the authorities and the banking sector, particularly, let's say, in France, where all the banks are managed by Inspecteur de Finance, require a European reorganization of the banking system. I didn't want to, you know, it's a complicated problem. I didn't want to go into everything. I didn't have time to go into everything. So it is not a solution to the competitiveness issue. And as far as the democratic deficit is concerned, actually this out-of-the-box solution has to actually fit the box as it is currently created. In other words, it has got to conform with Article 123 of the Lisbon Treaty, etc., because you can't throw out all the existing laws, because you would have total chaos. So you have these constraints, and it's within those constraints that you have to reorganize the euro.
Okay, thank you. Wendy?
I just wanted to make a comment on the democratic deficit. We seem to be being sold proposals which have as their strength that no treaty change is required. In other words, no consent is required. And obviously there is the problem of the pressure of time and so on. But there seems very little appetite for really embarking on a political debate, on a political campaign in support of the euro or the European Union. There's some discussion of it among Eurosceptics in the UK, but there's very little discussion about having a referendum, for example, about the future of the euro or the European Union. And there's been very little discussion of that here. And I think we should, instead of looking for every proposal that doesn't require a treaty change, we should face that issue squarely.
Sven?
Just very briefly on the democratic deficit. I think if we agree that, and I think in the end all the proposals rely on more power for European institutions, all the different proposals. And this will increase the democratic deficit which has been described. And this cannot go on forever, and it will create tensions. And therefore, our opinion is that after, and I would agree there with George Soros, first the crisis, the acute form of the crisis has to be solved. But then there has to be a convention process through which the institutions are renewed, through which there are consequences are taken, and then that's at least our position. There have to be national referendums over the new compromise, and the countries and the people must have the possibility to say, yes, we want this stronger federal Europe, or no, we don't want it, but not each country can block the progress of the others. So there must be a conscious decision for this European integration. I think to think that this can be solved in the long run by technocratic solutions would be politically naive, and we also need, after a big public discourse, the support of the people for the future of this integration process. And I personally believe that in the very largest number of states there will be a positive decision on this, because people know we will be very small in a globalized world, each of the different countries in Europe. And therefore I think this debate can be won by the pro-Europeans, and it has to be won.
Okay. Please. We have a microphone here, just to, we have so little time. I'm sorry, there's a question over there and a question. Yeah. I have to ask both of you. It says, I misjudged the time. Could you be very brief? Because I'd like to give the panelists some time to respond to each other, which they haven't been able to, and that would otherwise not be possible. Please.
I want to go back to Marcus's point about the banks and the big X he drew on them. As we speak about this, and as people are proposing that Europe controls the banks and all of that, we are in a situation where a hidden way for Germany to bail out its banks is to insist that somehow they're paid. What we also didn't get mentioned is, which wasn't mentioned, was the orderly default on some of the bonds of Greece, which was a move showing that the private market can absorb losses, and shareholders of banks and some debt holders of banks should absorb some of the losses as opposed to the public institutions. So once again, the banks get to just exist there, and presumably if there are euro bonds or other things, they will still be holding them and lending to them instead of to businesses. So I think the banking sector should not be exempted from all of the, whatever happens.
Okay. Question over here in the front. Okay.
Here's what I think is likely to happen. We are going to see the ECB targeting sovereign yields, which it can legitimately because transmission of monetary policy is completely broken. The ECB is the only legitimate firewall. No firewall is big enough against Italy and Spain. So that frees up EFSF money, which doubles the callable capital of the European Investment Bank, which is deleveraging at this time, the public institution we have. There, that gets you the Green New Deal, investment flows in the south. The ESM can then be used for pan-European bank capitalization, and we break the sovereign bank loop, perhaps partly with Marcus's proposal of SBs. We target the growth compact that Peter Bofinger and I wrote about trying to get restored once we've put the floor under the crisis. And then we look at the institutional structures and some of the inflation differentials that Wendy referred to. We have to have at least two tools of monetary policy. So we have recommended using differentiated credit reserve ratios within a single interest rate policy of the ECB, where if there is overheating, if there is a kind of inflation differential that you have, which you will have when you have convergence starting from different income levels, you will have different growth rates, you will have different inflation rates. And that all has to be part of the structural reform, which do need all the treaty changes. But anyway, this is my prediction. I may have egg on my face, but let's see.
Thanks very much. And last question over there, and then we're turning this to the panel.
No, a very short question indeed. We keep talking about democratic deficit as if any move towards European authority implies a democratic deficit, but we seem to forget that we now have two governments where we don't have elected prime ministers anymore as a result of the crisis, and nobody seems to think of that as a democratic deficit, but it seems to me it's a rather radical one.
Well, thank you. I very much agree with that statement. Could I ask the panelists, as a very short closing remarks, you have heard, you've heard other proposals than your own. Could you address, to the extent you wish to, and some of you already have in your proposals, could you address what you make of some of the other proposals and how they fit in with yours or don't fit in with yours? And try to do this in a minute, preferably. Starting off with Marcus, please.
Okay, thanks a lot. Let me say something about the sovereign fund, and also which is also true for the redemption fund. I think it's an interesting idea to use future seniority as a collateral in a sense. To incentivize countries to get down the debt level, I think I have some problems with how credible these rules are. Let's suppose a country, suffers a little recession and then doesn't satisfy these rules. Will we kick it out? And I think it's not credible at all. The same critique applies for the German redemption fund proposal. These rules, I think, are not credible at the end of the day because the politicians won't have the will and the guts to say, okay, this country we will kick out of this favorable treatment because they don't satisfy the rule in this year or that year. I think that's one problem. But overall, I think it's a very good idea to bring seigniorage revenue up front and make some arrangement this way.
Wendy?
I've really got nothing further to add. There's some fantastic ideas. I'm just worried about implementation. Let's put it as simply as that.
George? Sven?
No, I have nothing to add because I couldn't quite hear you, so I'll ask you afterwards what you were saying.
Well, I tried to do this a bit in my speech. I think that the totality of the measures has to relieve enough in the crisis countries. So therefore, suggestions which are too limited in scope and economic effect, they will not be enough. On the other hand, they might not be so bold that they are seen in the surplus countries as a total drain on their resources. And therefore, I think that's the key of the problem. And there I think, to me, that George Soros' proposal is perhaps too bold, because in the end it would mean that the surplus countries would be seen as paying with their seigniorage for the debt of others, which might be a big problem of legitimacy, while Marcus' proposal, if I understand it correctly, would basically not relieve very much of the large interest rate burden which comes of the large debt, and therefore I think it needs probably more a combination of several measures which add up to enough of that, while not there will be one big bullet with which you can hit all of that. We haven't spoken about the contribution of stronger demand in the surplus countries, which I think is important, and it should be acknowledged that wage policy is doing a bit of that now in Germany, and I hope it goes further and more trade unions negotiating, and I hope we get a minimum wage. This would also help. Point.
Right. Yanis, what do you make of the other proposals? I mean, yours was relatively, didn't require any treaty changes, as you said, though some of the banking suggests, certainly in some countries would probably have some serious legal implications. I don't think in Germany you could just do this by a simple law. But what would be your, George and Yanis, what would be your reaction to for example, also the...
Well, very briefly, I like them very much. My great concern and worry is that they are going to hit against a brick wall, especially in this country. That is why I calibrated my proposal in such a way that, firstly, when I look at an audience of Germans, I can say to them that this proposal does not involve the German taxpayer guaranteeing the debts of deficit countries. It does not involve debt buyouts. It simply involves a debt conversion with the ECB doing what Sonny said, managing rationally and centrally debt, not by creating new debt, but substituting and in the process reducing the interest mountain that the Eurozone as a whole is facing. One brief comment on the democratic deficit, because I agree too that it is the largest and most ominous deficit of them all. But let me tell you, and I agree with Alan here, the greatest threat democracy in Europe is facing today is the threat of the unfolding and unraveling and proceeding crisis. As we speak, the German government is misleading the German parliament, the Greek government is misleading the Greek parliament about what we're doing with the PSI, what we're doing with our bailout Mark II. And the more we deceive people, the less likely electorates will be at some point when and if the powers that be come to their senses and propose a decent plan, that we can put together this plan. At the moment, in my country, we have complete and utter desperation, not only because of the dire circumstances, but because there is a deep sense that the sacrifices that are deep and are being made are being thrown in a black hole instead of being an investment into a new future. And I'm sure that this is precisely the feeling of the average German, that money is being wasted after good money, it's being poured into a black hole, and the result of it will be nevertheless the disintegration of the whole thing. This is why my proposal is trying to do something extremely simple, to say, what tools do we have here today? How can we apply them tomorrow morning so as to go down to work, get down to work by Tuesday afternoon?
Okay. And George, please.
You see, I think that there are you can combine or develop some of these ideas, you can modify them, but first there has to be a recognition by the authorities and I would say by the German public, because the fact is that there is a democratic deficit now because it's a crisis situation where the creditors are in charge. Germany didn't want to be in that position, but has to accept it that that's where they are, and they have got to make a decision whether they want to have a Europe, a united Europe, or not. Once that public opinion that penetrates into let's say into the higher levels of the Bundesbank has been established, then one can find out-of-the-box solutions. Until there is that willingness, one can design any number. I think in the last 12 months, I must have put forward at least 12 of these suggestions. Each one is a little bit more radical because I think that the situation has deteriorated. But until we've got that kind of consensus, there's not much point in sort of discussing the details.
Okay. We must end now. The warnings I'm getting have becoming more urgent, I have to tell you. So I'd like to thank the panel for this debate. Thank you.